All right, today is the satisfaction theory of the atonement. You might say, the what? Well, we have been talking about what really happened at the cross when Jesus died, and we've been looking at some different theories of the atonement. Atonement, of course, meaning at one, how we became one with God again. How exactly did this happen when Jesus died? What did that do to help us to be reconciled to God? Today, we are going to be talking about the satisfaction theory of the atonement. And if you study the satisfaction theory, you're going to come across the name Anselm of Canterbury, because he is the one that really propagated this idea and really put it together. So here is a little drawing of Anselm. Anselm lived 1033 to 1109. And Anselm wrote a book, which is actually a 2-volume series, and it's called Cur Deus Homo, which means why the God-man? Why the God-man? So he wrote this book to question, why did Jesus have to be both God and man? What is the purpose behind that? And he came up with this satisfaction theory. Now, this book, or these books, they're kind of interesting because they're written in a dialogue between Anselm and a guy named Boso, B-O-S-O, Boso. And so it goes through the whole thing. It's like a conversation. Anselm says this, Boso says this, Anselm says this, and Boso says this. And the reason he wrote it that way, he had this funny way of saying it. He says, because you write it this way, it helps people understand better. His quote of, it becomes more understandable for, quote, less quick minds. And so he could just write a whole theological treatise about what he believed about what happened at the cross. But he says, let me just put it in this kind of a story or conversational format, because some people who aren't so quick might be able to get it. So maybe that's us. I don't know. So I'm not going to go through this whole book, but I've gone through it and I've pulled out a few quotes I'm going to share with you, just to give you an idea of what he is talking about with this whole satisfaction theory. Now, one thing we have to understand when we talk about Anselm's satisfaction theory is the culture in which he lived. He lived in an honor-shame culture. In an honor-shame culture, you had levels of society. You had an overlord who was probably a knight who worked for the king. And under the overlord, under a knight, you had serfs. So you had serfs, and then a knight or some kind of overlord, and then the king. And they all served each other. They just had their own place in society, and you couldn't necessarily get out of one. And everything you did was, maybe not everything, but a lot of what you did was to bring honor to that person above you, and they in turn would be your benefactor. They would then in turn do things for you. So the serfs, they would receive from their overlord that was over them, but they would do everything they could to honor him and never bring shame on him. And the knights would do the same thing. They would get from the king, and they would then want to bring shame, or not to bring shame to the king. They'd want to bring honor to the king. So this is a society that Anselm understood. And he looked at the gospel message, he looked at the Bible, he took what he knew about his society and put that on the gospel. And that is something I think we always have to be very careful about, because the gospel was not written in our society. We can't take our ideas and our culture and put it on top of the Bible. We need to figure out what is going on in the Bible. What does the Bible actually say? And then see how that's supposed to inform our culture. But here's the issue that Anselm had. He took his culture and he applied it in on the gospel. So what is this satisfaction theory? We'll talk about it, and then I'll give you some weaknesses and some strengths that I see in it. So here is just a definition, if you want it in a nutshell. The voluntary death of Christ restored the honor of God that was lost in the fall of man. So man and in our sin, and he defines sin, we'll talk about that in a minute what he thinks sin is. It's not so much that we hurt the holy character of God, but that we brought shame on this one who is above us in societal order. We brought shame on him, and something needs to be done to bring that honor back to him. That's why it's called the satisfaction theory. And satisfaction, when we think of satisfaction, we might think of, okay, I'm good, I'm satisfied. We'll talk about God the Father being satisfied with the death of Jesus. He said, that's enough, that will pay for the debt. That's a different kind of satisfaction. That's a satisfaction where it says, okay, I'm satisfied, I'm good. The satisfaction in Anselm's culture was a phrase for bringing honor to the person above you. If this person above me in this societal ladder, if I brought shame on them, I would bring satisfaction by changing my shame to honor and doing something to make up for that shame. bring my loyalty back to that person, and then do something extra, right? That is satisfying this system. It's bringing satisfaction. So think of it in that way, and it starts to make a lot of sense. So now Anselm, he had certain points that he laid out that helped people understand how he saw the atonement. So we're going to look at them quickly. Number one, this helps you understand his line of thinking. Number one, God's purpose for man. Why did God make man in the first place? What are we doing here? His idea is that man is supposed to live in happiness with God. That's why he made us, to live in happiness with him. Hey, he uses the phrase, man should have a happy immortality, both in body and soul. So we should be happy. We should enjoy an eternal blessedness with God. And of course, part of that is we were never supposed to die, right? Because if we're supposed to, like Adam and Eve, they were supposed to just fellowship with God forever, supposed to live in forever immortal happiness with God. That is the point. So in discussion between Anselm and Boso and his works, Boso is the learner. He's learning from Anselm. And he states this. Boso says, look, I now understand it is to be necessary for God to complete what he has begun, lest there be an unseemly falling off from his design. In other words, God's design was for us to live in perfect blessedness with him, but because of sin, it's destroyed, and now God is going to want to fix this problem. That's what Boso is beginning to understand. So that's number one. God's purpose for man is to live in happiness with him. Anselm's point number two is the definition of sin. What is sin? Sin is neglecting to honor God through complete obedience. Okay, neglecting to honor God through complete obedience. Just like the serf should be obedient to the knight above him, we should be obedient to God. Let me read a little bit from Anselm and Boso's discussion in discussing sin. Anselm, if man or angel always rendered to God his due, he would never sin. Boso, I cannot deny that. Anselm, therefore to sin is nothing else than not to render to God his due. Remember, this is honor shame. Boso, what is the debt which we owe to God? Anselm, every wish of a rational creature should be subject to the will of God. So Anselm says, we are just supposed to have every wish of ours subject to God, and sin is when we do not have every wish of ours subject to God. So he says this, he who does not render this honor, which is due to God, robs God of his own and dishonors him, and this is sin. So he's not looking at a way of dishonoring the holy character of a just and righteous God. He's saying that in our action, just like in an honor-shame society, we have dishonored the one above us, and that is sin. And of course, the result of sin is destroying what God had perfectly designed in the beginning. There would be this great relationship between God and man all the time. Number three, Anselm's third point, the result of sin. Okay, God's purpose for man, live in happiness with him. Number two, what's sin? You didn't honor God. Number three, what's the result of sin? What happens? An unpayable debt caused by stripping God of his honor. Remember the honor-shame society. So it is an unpayable debt caused by stripping God of his honor. Anselm explains it this way. Let me read what Anselm says in the book. Moreover, so long as he does not restore what he has taken away, this is the sinner, he remains in fault. And it will not suffice merely to restore what has been taken away, but considering the contempt offered, he ought to restore more than he took away. For as one who imperils another's safety does not enough by merely restoring his safety without making some compensation for the anguish incurred, so he who violates another's honor does not enough by merely rendering honor again. So he's saying we can't just give back to God. We owe God our complete obedience. We didn't do it. We can't just give it back to him now. We have to do something above and beyond that. That was their culture. If I was a serf and I did something to dishonor the knight above me, I couldn't just give him now what he's supposed to have. I need to do something extra over and above that. However, this is not going to go very well for man because we can't do that. We were supposed to live in complete obedience to God because we didn't. Let's say it was even one sin. One sin, we didn't live in complete obedience to God. How are we going to make that up? Because I could say, okay, from now on, I'm going to live in obedience to God. How do I make up that one I didn't give up? Because I could live perfectly the rest of my life, and I still cannot make it up because I have to do more than more than I was supposed to do. Let me illustrate it this way. Let's say that you owed me a debt and you're supposed to pay me $100 a month. And so every month you're paying me $100 to pay off this debt. And 1 month goes by and you forget. Oh man, I'm sorry. Last June, I totally forgot to pay you. I tell you what, to make this up, I'm going to now restart and keep paying you $100 a month. Have you actually made up for what I was wrong? No. One of these months, you have to give me $200 because from now on out, you still owe me $100 a month. Just giving me that is not going to fix the wrong from the past. You have to go back and fix that. And so what he's saying here, Anselm is saying is, okay, we owe God complete obedience all the time. If we mess up even one time, and then we decide to live perfectly the rest of our life out, that's not good enough because we have to fix that one we did in the past. But I can't live more than perfectly. I can't undo a sin from the past. This causes a big problem for man. Number 4, how do we do this? This leads us to the problem. We cannot restore God's honor by being really, really good or doing something because we owe him everything, even giving extra money or doing something extra. That doesn't make up for a past sin because we already owe him the best of everything that we have and everything that we do. So how can we restore the honor of God that we lost in our sin? Which brings us to number 4, the means of restoring God's honor. And here's 3 ways that Anselm gives that you can restore his honor. Number 1, he talks about payment or punishment. Payment or punishment is necessary. Anselm says in his discussion with Boso, does it seem to you that he wholly preserves his honor if he allows him to be so defrauded of it as that he should neither receive satisfaction nor punish the one defrauding him? Boso says, I dare not say so. Anselm says, therefore the honor taken away must be repaid or punishment must follow. So there is a payment or is a punishment. There's a problem though with these. Let's say I'm going to try to have this fault that I had, the sin that I had fixed with punishment. Punishment doesn't fit in with the overall purpose of God in Anselm's theory. Anselm's theory is that we're supposed to live in eternal blessedness with God. Well, if I have to experience punishment, I can't be living in eternal blessedness with God because let's say the punishment is hell. I can't live in eternal blessedness with God when I'm in hell. And so this doesn't work well with Anselm, but there's a problem with payment. Okay, if I say, okay, I can't be eternally punished because of my sin because and live in fellowship with God at the same time, I can't do that. So how about the payment? I have the sin, I need to pay it. The problem is, like we already discussed, that I can't pay a debt with something that I owe today, like that $100. And I owe God perfect obedience all the time. I can't obey God more perfectly in the future to make up for when I didn't obey him in the past. And so I have a problem. There's no way that I can do this. The second bullet point, that God's honor must be restored by man, okay? So punishment isn't going to work for fixing my sin. Payment won't work because I can't do that, but it needs to be a man. It needs to be man who restores this honor to God. Man needs to make a payment. It's not like God can just step in and make a payment himself for an animal or whatever. It has to be a man. Which brings me to the third point, which is that the restoration of God's honor requires the God-man. See, remember, he's writing this book. Why the God-man? Cur Deus Homo. Why the God-man? And he's saying, look, man requires his debt. Man cannot pay it. He can't be punished enough to take care of it because then he can't fulfill God's purpose of living in blessedness with God. And he can't repay it because he doesn't have the means with which to repay it. So he says, you know what's going to happen here? What happened is the God-man comes, the God who has 2 natures infused into one. And as God, he does not owe the debt, so therefore he can pay it and take care of that problem we had in the past. But he also is a man, so he can pay it on behalf of man. And so that's why there is the God-man. So it brings us to a question. How did the sacrifice of Jesus satisfy God's honor? Okay, and we're going to look at the weaknesses and strengths of this in a little bit. So you say, okay, Jesus as a God-man came along. He was a man. He restored God's honor. How did this work? I mean, what was it about the death of Jesus that allowed for God's honor to be satisfied here? A few things to look at. He says his death was a gift that he did not owe. Jesus did not owe the gift of death. but he did it anyway. Remember, if I were to try to do something above and beyond, let's say I was even going to go, I'm going to die for God, right? I'm going to be a martyr. I'm going to die for God. I'm going to die for Jesus. That's not enough because I already owe God the best of everything I can possibly do. So if there's a situation where I'm at me a martyr, if I go through with it, I'm not making up for some past sin. I'm just giving God the best that I possibly can right now. But see, Jesus did not die. A man deserves to die because of our sin. Jesus did not deserve to die. So when he died, he made a payment, but there was no debt that he was supposed to pay. Which brings us to number 2, he deserved a reward, the whole honor shame society. If I were to do something, if I were to bring a gift, to the one above me, I get a reward. That's just how this whole situation works. He'd be my benefactor. I'd give to him, he'd give to me. That's just how it works. So Jesus died, and he paid this debt of death that we deserve, and he didn't. And so for God to be honorable, he has to give a reward to Jesus. He can't just say, oh, well, that's nice, Jesus died. No, he has to give reward in the honor shame culture. He has to give a reward. The problem is, how do you give reward to somebody who has everything? It's like finding a Christmas gift to somebody who has that all. What do you do? I mean, so here's God, and he says, okay, Jesus died, and he deserves a gift for dying, but what can I give him that he doesn't already have? When you have the end of the year programs for your kids, and maybe at school or whatever they're in to get trophies, and they line up in there, and Joey here is going to get a trophy for something. They don't run to Joey's room, grab a trophy off a shelf and bring and give it to him. No, they're going to give him something he doesn't already have. That's what the gift is. And so here's God, and he's got Jesus who has died, who paid this debt, of death. What's he going to give him? There's nothing you can give Jesus he doesn't already have, which brings us to the third one. The reward was then given to mankind. Jesus died, this debt of death. There's nothing God could give him he didn't already have. And so basically what happens is we get it. God says, here, Jesus, I'll give you the gift. He says, I can't, that's not a gift for me because I have everything. I tell you what, let's give it to mankind. So the reward that God would give in an honor shame culture, the reward that God would give to Jesus, because Jesus couldn't accept it, he had everything, it then overflows to mankind, which is how mankind's sin can be forgiven. That's how the satisfaction theory works. It sounds difficult, but it's really pretty simple at the heart of it, okay? Well, let's look at it a little bit, the merits. What are some good things about this theory? Well, it is rooted in the just nature of God. God can't overlook sin. Sin has to be dealt with. That's very true. It's very good. Anselm recognized that God is just. Just means making things right. You're always going to do what's right. God was concerned with making things right, and Anselm noticed that. But in his eyes, he came at it through the honor shame culture rather than how we have hurt the holy nature of God. So he's seeing it a little bit differently. Number 2, merit. It emphasizes the awfulness of sin. Yeah, it talks about how awful sin is. It's not like the moral influence theory where God was just doing this, the great example of Jesus dying for us, but it recognizes how awful sin is, that we deserve a debt. Number 3, it highlights the deity of Jesus. It talks about how, Anselm talks about how Jesus is so great, that he did not owe a debt. Then he could give that to other people, and he had everything, so he couldn't receive a gift. So it really highlights the deity of Jesus. But what about the weaknesses? Weaknesses, it removes punishment from payment. We talked about, remember, how you can do punishment or payment, giving a special gift. I don't think you put enough emphasis on punishment because punishment is a part of sin. So I think he should have had more emphasis on punishment, because for Anselm, sin is an affront to the honor of God. What I believe the Bible tells us is that sin is an affront to the holy nature of God. And that's a different thing. Punishment for us, the wages of sin is death. Okay, death is a punishment. And so I think he should have had more emphasis on that. Number 2, Jesus did not die to restore God's honor, but to restore God's creation. This is the reality of it. This is not about God's honor. It's about bringing God's creation back into fellowship with him. Colossians 1:19-20 says, for it pleased the Father that in him all the fullness should dwell, and by him to reconcile all things to himself, By him, whether things on earth or things in heaven, having made peace through the blood of the cross. He's trying to bring us all back into relationship and to him and be reconciled to him. Number 3, a weakness. It focuses on merit over substitution. Now, Anselm didn't take it quite this far, but he says, okay, basically the merit of Jesus, Jesus died, Jesus paid this debt. And so what he did, his merits couldn't be applied to him. He didn't need it, so it applied to you. Well, later on, especially through Thomas Aquinas in the Catholic Church, this whole idea of merit became the treasury of merit. And the treasury of merit is basically the idea where God takes things that Jesus did and prayers of the saints and Mary and all these things. They become like, they go into this big treasury. And when people sin, the more lighter sins, the venial sins, some of the merit from that treasury gets taken out and gets applied to that person. And that's what indulgences are all about. I'll pay some money and some of that merit will be then given to other people. I don't see anything biblical at all about that. I want to read this really quickly to you, and we're going to be through here in just a minute. This is from the Catechism of the Catholic Church about indulgences. It says, an indulgence is a remission before God of the temporal punishment due to sins whose guilt has already been forgiven, which the faithful Christian who is duly disposed gains under certain prescribed conditions through the action of the church, which, as the minister of redemption, dispenses and applies with authority the treasury of the satisfactions of Christ and the saints. So it's this treasury thing. It's like Jesus' death didn't really forgive our sins. It's not powerful enough. You got to have all the prayers of the saints and things Jesus did, and then that's a merit. So that was built off from Anselm's satisfaction theory, and I think that's a very unfortunate thing. Now, just to sum it up, here is our picture once again. I believe penal substitution is the heart of what happened at the cross. We're going to talk about that in more detail. Some of these other ones, including satisfaction theory, was God's honor satisfied? Well, yes, because when we sin, we dishonor God, but that's not the heart of it. The heart of it is that we have impugned the holy nature of God, and we deserve eternal death because of that. And the death of Jesus made that payment that we were supposed to make. That is what actually happened at the cross. So stay tuned. We'll talk more later about the different aspects of the atonement theory. God bless you, and I will see you then.